the good news is about those 3 chapters we have to do today is I think the first one is a little bit easier for most people at St. Francis than it might be at some other church. Jesus's death on the cross matters, but not because he paid for our sins. Most of us grew up in some type of a situation where that redemption type of policy, that paying for our sins was a norm, and accepted, and for a lot of different reasons. But Borg is trying to help us to go beyond just that. I think what changed my mind about it, and I'll ask in a little bit what changed, what helped you to move along these lines. I think what changed my mind was, who is Jesus paying the price to? Who's exacting that a price has to be paid for? And because I could never quite answer that question, then the whole redemption, that we have to buy our way out of our sins, began making less and less sense to me. How did you begin to, and I guess I shouldn't assume that everyone's completely out of that idea of paying for our sins, because there's some good ideas that are there. But what he's trying to say is that's not the heart of Christianity, but in some places it becomes the very heart. So what helped you to move beyond just that as the core issue of your religion? What helped you to take some of those steps?
I couldn't see innocent little babies or children having done anything wrong. It just boggled my mind.
Yeah. And especially because of that idea of original sin, it essentially says, yep, you're doing something, they're wrong.
I couldn't do that.
Yeah. How about the rest of you? What helped you to make some of that transition?
Well, for me, it was moving from a conservative church to the Methodist church. And I moved to First Church as a university student. And Gil Zimmerman was there, and then followed by Dwayne Zimmerman, and both of them just were eloquent about no one's going to make it if anybody doesn't make it. It's like all are in, or it's not going to work.
Yeah,
it's not going to be heaven without everybody.
Yeah. Sometimes it just takes one person asking the question differently. I remember my first year of seminary. We're in a class on Old Testament studies. A woman from the Netherlands, her name was Kristen de Troyer, was our teacher, and she just asked this question: what if there wasn't a real Moses? And you heard gasp behind me. Now that didn't bother me at all, because I was at the point where it didn't have to be a real person, Moses. But just that, and our discussion afterwards, as we tried to say, well, why would she say that? And that opened up avenues of being, of seeing that they hadn't thought of before. And I think that's part of what Marcus Borg is trying to do here, is he's saying, if we only see the cross one way, it blinds us to a whole lot of other things. And maybe it blinds us to some of the most important things we should see.
I think for me, it was about seeing what the point he makes here, that Jesus died because he was holding forth an unpopular opinion. And I did a lot of reading of things in my early life that said to me that Jesus wasn't the only one who died. Other people died because they chose to hold an unpopular opinion.
Right.
And I had a lot of trouble with the redemptive suffering thing
Yeah.
for a long time until I started seeing that other people did that too. I mean, when I saw the movie Gandhi, the people marching on the British installation that were just getting beaten down, that to me was the same thing of
Uh-huh.
redemptive suffering. They suffered so that people after them could do better, but I never quite got the suffering because people before did something bad, you know. But
Yeah. But that becomes so much of the story that I think people just repeat that story a lot, and so they think it tells the whole story. But you're right that there's all kinds of examples of people who have been silenced because they were, what they were saying was unpopular. And maybe it's one of the most common stories in the world. Think of just the last couple of years, how much we've tried to silence and how much we get criticized for trying to silence other voices. It's easy to do, isn't it? But I think that at least part of what's powerful about the Jesus on the cross story is that it essentially says it's not the end of the story, which is of course what that silencing is trying to do, isn't it? I don't like what Jenny has to say, so I'm going to silence her so I never have to think about her anymore. Right? And suddenly her voice becomes louder because of that death. And it's that sense of not necessarily even physically living after, but not dying because the body is dead. We have a modern day way to look at that, right? Martin Luther King was killed when we were all young, especially compared to now, right? But his voice is far from silenced, is it?
Hmm.
And you think about this 2,000 years from now, whose voice is going to be remembered better? Martin Luther King or the ones who opposed him? Who do we remember better in that time 2,000 years ago? Jesus or Pontius Pilate, who put him to death? So how is it that you are going to get in trouble because of the words that you have, the words that you have to say, the words that are in your heart and waiting to be spoken? Who's not going to like it?
Well, that Jesus is the only way to God is not something I want to tell my daughter-in-law
Right.
or her family. No.
Right. To make it into a singular path like that goes against what Jesus was saying, because he was fighting singular paths, wasn't he? Roman authorities were saying you have to be quiet because you're going against what we're setting up here as the norm. And essentially what his life screamed and his death screamed is that you, Roman authorities, don't get to define profound life. You don't get to define what meaning is. You don't get to define the depth of this existence. And how many How many have seen people in your life who have tried to define all of those things in perfect and easy ways? And in some ways, many people are here at St. Francis because they were crucified, at least in the death that that church gave to them, and said, you can no longer be here if you're going to be that, if you're going to say that, if you're going to act that way, if you're going to believe that way. And so essentially crucified them in the church sense. And the good news about St. Francis is it says, nope, you're still alive. Right? How did you hear that? How did you find that? Not just at St. Francis, but how did you get beyond whatever somebody had done, somebody had said, the limitations they put on you? Who spoke the right words to you? For me, it was a Baptist preacher named Brother Larry, who was basically saying Jesus paid for your sins, but I didn't hear it like that. I heard, Jim, you don't have to be stopped by what you were. Step into a newness, step into more. So he thought he was only giving me the death on the cross story, but he was opening me up to something that was much more than that. How about the rest of you? Who began speaking those words to you? Began telling you that there's more life than what you have been told.
I think one of the people that did that to me, and it wasn't around Jesus so much, but my professor of cultural anthropology in college, and we did the course was study a bunch of case studies of different cultures around the world, and just looking at the religions of different cultures, the family practices of different cultures, and just seeing that there were other viable means of living besides the one that I'd been grown up and fashioned into, just made me think, well, maybe everything that I grew up believing isn't the only thing, because here were all these other cultures living happily everywhere around the world, totally different than I did. So.
And that's why, Doris, very often religion sees education as an opponent, because it opens the world in ways that religion isn't always willing to do, because religion likes to have the right answer, and education sometimes challenges that answer. Thank you. I shouldn't say just religion. I should say bad religion challenges that. Right? Because religion should always open us up, not close us down. But it often does the opposite, doesn't it? But that's the same thing. Here's your transition to the next chapter. That's the same thing that happens with politics as well. Politics is about right answers. And as we, and the more we look at religion through a political lens, the easier it is sometimes to shut down. So how do we do this when it's when he's asserting very strongly that the Bible is political. It's a political book, isn't it? And And at one point he said, it's not only political, but politically subversive. And so what it's trying to say is that one right answer that society has given, or that religion has given, or whatever has given, is not the way that good, that we should do. That societies commonly organize in one way, and it says, is that the right answer? Is that the only answer? Now, how many here are moderately political, at least?
Moderately, what was that?
Moderately political, at least.
Oh,
Yeah.
My conservative friends have sometimes argued with me about religion not being political, that it shouldn't be political, and yet they're at the same time backing Donald Trump because of, and you can see their religious reasons for doing that. Religion is almost always political because it deals with value. What do we value? And how do we help that to happen? Because of course, part of what politics is about moving the stuff out of the way that is stopping my value from happening. And so if I see Judy as the evil in the world that's stopping my value from happening, as she usually does,
Yeah.
then I might think I'm being religious, but I'm also being political, because I'm looking at her and I'm trying to set up things that say, stop who she is, stop that from being part of the definition of who we are. And good religion says, no matter how mean Judy is, I can't just write her off, right? That there's something more. So why is politics, bad politics, wrong? What happens in bad politics?
And they make enemies out of the opponent.
They make enemies. That's exactly right. Yeah.
I think the other thing is the way I see what I consider bad politics is when they use their power to take away rights and kindness and compassion for people who have less power.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
They are, I think he used the words talking specifically about the economy, but he said they are exploitive.
Yeah.
Economically exploitive. He did say they are chronically violent as well. Right? That these domination systems ultimately try to force their way. And that religion should be that which says, is there a different way of doing it? Not always easily. One of the most interesting stories in the Old Testament is the book of Judges, where Israel got to the promised land and God didn't set up any government, right? Just said, you guys all just kind of take care of yourself, and every once in a while I'll raise up somebody to be a judge that will take care of the issue of the day. That wasn't good enough for the Hebrew nation, and after a while they started screaming at their prophet. A couple hundred years though, they said, no, you got to give us a king like everybody else has, right? What is it that we are screaming for that maybe is our wanting a king instead of trusting each other? Because bottom line is the religion has to do more with us trusting us. In a domination system, a bad government is about limiting the number of people you have to trust. It is ruled by a few rather than by larger than that. So when you see any kind of things about voter suppression, for example, usually it's trying to say there's certain people that I don't want to trust their vote as much as my own. So let's make it harder for them to not vote.
It takes away their individuality.
It does.
It-
Yeah, bad politics takes away that, and good religion says don't do that, and steps into the politics and says, let's change the politics so that it's a good politic and a good religion, and respects that person as well. The hard part is how many have at least one person in the politic right now, somewhere in your life, that you would like to silence, that's not quite convenient to you, definitely not easy to you. The other class that I'm teaching is a remarkable class. You should read this book sometime. It's called Revolutionary Love. And it is essentially trying to say, how do I deal with that person, even the one that I want to silence? How do I deal with that person around issues where we can show that we are in relationship to each other? How do we step into a space where we're not afraid to be in a political space, but we're also not going to silence each other in that political space? How do we turn the conversation into a relational one rather than an issues one? Because the Bible tells us essentially to be subversive of some of the ways that are easy, right? Don't deal with that person who was beat up on the side of the road, because you'll sully yourself. And Jesus says, no, go and care for that person first, even though it's religiously or politically not convenient. If we take religion seriously, it means we also have to take politics seriously. Jesus had to deal with, from the very first story of his life, the Herod story of sending people to kill him, right? He had to deal with politics, all the way to the very end of his life, where Pontius Pilate put him on a cross. What are you going to do? Doesn't quite name politics as the great evil, but it basically says you're going to have to, on a regular basis, confront politics. Probably at all different levels. How many have had to face politics, for example, somewhere in a church?
Yeah.
You know, we don't say that kind of thing here. We don't do that. We don't, you know, or we all have to do it this way. And it has a singular answer. I think about, as we're getting ready to come back to St. Francis sometime in the next few months, I want to hug everybody right at first. That's one of the things I want to do. And I know that some people aren't going to be quite ready for that yet. That they're still going to be partially quarantined, even though they come to the building. How do I shut down my right answer in order to allow that person to be a non-hugger in that moment? Because I think hugging is a really good thing for all of us to do. But how do I not be the domination system that government can be? And how do I speak into all those other spaces to help them as well? That's where religion is important in politics. So when you look around your world, how are you creating a world that's not like, in the Old Testament, not like Egypt, that domination system of the government of Egypt? How are you creating a world that is not Pontius Pilate forcing his way in? How are you creating a world that is not dominated by the Romans, but you're changing it to be one of love, one of values that politics doesn't always honor? What are you doing that way?
Well, I think that anytime we do even the smallest thing, whether it's give $100 to the food bank or volunteer for an afternoon someplace, we're saying that the domination system is not one that I agree with. You know, anytime we give up something of ourselves, and it, you know, some of us can do more than others. I don't have the physical vitality to do what I did when I was 30, but I can still do something.
No, you hit 40 and everything goes downhill, right, Doris? It's been tough the last couple of years.
It has. So, but I think that whatever little thing we do is you know, a statement that this should be different.
Yeah.
You know, and enough little things make a big thing after a while.
And one of the ways that Borg framed that was, he talked about God's dream. What is God's dream for this space? And I think that's part of what I hear you saying is, if I look at my world, what is it that doesn't feel like it's part of God's dream?
Yeah.
Yeah. How about the rest of you? Where are you?
Sorry, Jim. I find it really hard to answer during this quarantine time because my usual expressions of doing for others have been pretty much curtailed. I'm just home, you know, and so it frustrates me a bit that I don't have an answer to that. I can't say I went to visit so and so because they were having a bad day, or I, you know, showed up for something.
Yeah.
Because at this point, I still don't feel like I should do that. For other people's sake, more than my own, I think. And so it feels like I'm kind of stuck for an answer for that kind of question.
Yeah. So one of the ways I would answer that, Judy, is to tell you the story of Gladys. Gladys lived in a great big retirement community, like building community. It's called Freedom Plaza. And when I went and visited her, I was an intern, my first year as a pastor, right? And I was visiting our older folks. We had 400 people over 90 years old in that church. And I went to see Gladys and her husband, and she started listing all the things she used to be, all the ways that she had done church. But she was 94 years old, and so she wasn't quite at that energy level, not quite at that space any longer. So I looked at her and said, what if we do something different? And she helped me start a service inside of her facility, inside of Freedom Plaza, right? Not doing all that stuff at church that she used to do, but just making sure that once a month that she advertised and said, Pastor Jim's coming and we're going to have a little service. So sometimes it is redefining what is meant by where you meet the politic. She had to deal with, so that I didn't have to, she had to deal with whatever the politic was at Freedom Plaza. And she knew the people there at Freedom Plaza much better than what I ever would. not just the residents, but the management. And she was able to negotiate that wonderfully well. And we were able to have good services there, tiny services. You know, there were about 20 to 30 of us or so. But she was the one who was able to do that, not me. So sometimes a thing like this asks us to look at our lives differently than what they were before. How about the rest of you? What's it calling out to you? One of the things that one of the terms you used, and I think it was in the last chapter, but I think it's appropriate here, is you used the term vampire Christians.
I love that.
Yeah. And I think that if we're sitting in a space and we're only saying what is in it for me, we become vampire Christians. But that idea of being involved in politics says that I'm supposed to do something to change the world, to essentially bring, in words that Jesus would use, the kingdom of God here on earth, right? To change this kingdom that I live in into something different than what it is. So what's not right about the kingdom where you live, and what needs to be changed?
I was just thinking, every day I get mail. I call them the begs, you know, they're begging for this charity. They're begging for that charity. And I am trying to see, because we don't go out to eat anymore, taking that money and putting it to the good charities. So I think that's something I can do from home that's helping,
Nice.
because I don't go anywhere.
Yeah. What a great way to do it, because all of us are saving money by being at home. How do we divert that money in some way or another to the begs,
Yeah.
or to whatever it is that we care about and we know that is changing the world? Nice.
Well, I think I'm doing something that started out maybe as a vampire Christian thing. It's just I've missed meeting up with the people at the church so much. And when I got an email about making sandwiches for the Casa Maria Soup Kitchen, and that we would we'd make our sandwiches and then deliver them to the church on Saturday mornings. And I go, aha, that's a way to meet at church.
That is.
So yeah, so I figure, and there's no harm in making sandwiches. That's a good thing to do. But I was still doing it mostly for me. I mean, I don't know how these people, you know, I don't see the other end of me making the sandwiches, you know, as a benefit to them, even though I know it is. But and I don't like making the sandwiches all by myself, but that's the way I have to do it. I think it used to be a group thing, and we can't do that now.
Yeah.
So one day a week, I get busy and make my sandwiches, throw them back in the freezer. We were told to freeze the bread before making the sandwiches. It makes it easier to spread the peanut butter. And I've gotten to know some other people, because some of the people that bring sandwiches at that time are from other churches. They're not just from our church. But I've also gotten, and now they're selling the
Mugs.
the Choose Love mugs. And they're doing that during the time when we're delivering the sandwiches. So I get to see more people. So I'm benefiting now by doing this. And like I say, it's in a way for me, but it's helping other people.
Nice.
So that makes it okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but what you're talking about, Jenny, is community, and community always helps us sometimes to, the community that strengthens me often helps me to go and subvert that which isn't strengthening our society. Right? I know that Scott and I were involved in a thing called JFON, Justice for Our Neighbors, and it helps having that group around to be able to do that work, doesn't it, Scott?
Yeah, I was just thinking about over the last 20 years or so, how I've gotten to know the huge number of people in all different areas that are working on immigration issues in our community, and how there's so much interconnection. It interconnects a huge number of faith communities, and the overlap of the all of the different efforts that are going on there. And it's amazing to meet people, and so many people that have really focused years of their lives working on immigration, being out in the desert, dealing with people who are in trouble. And it's really inspiring to meet these people and connect with them.
Yep. Yep. That's one of the reasons I like it as well. To see everything that people are doing, to care, making a transition to the last chapter about somebody who is in need in the moment, that someplace where justice is not being served. To be passionate about, is his word, passionate about justice and the poor. And JFON is an example of that. And I love how subversive JFON feels to me sometimes, because people say this, they've always said this kind of thing. They've said, well, why don't they come legally? And so I say, well, that's what JFON's about. We're trying to help them come legally. So come help me. And then they have to decide, do they really mean that they want people to come legally, or they just don't want them to come at all?
Yeah.
Right. And they have to deal with the fact that what they're saying is just an excuse, or they have to change. So Scott, thank you for being involved with JFON, because it definitely is saying we're going to set up another organization that subverts, right? So how about poor? What keeps us from caring well about the poor? And by poor, don't just think just the ones who have no food. Think of also those who have no power. Right? Those who are essentially that systems are against them in one way or another. He talks a lot about Amos, and Amos is a remarkable book if you haven't read it. It's a remarkable book that essentially says we have to change the way we're thinking. And what we think way too easily, as Rabbi Lerner talks about in the book that I told you about, Revolutionary Love, we've set up these things that says this is how society works. And love runs counterintuitive to all of that. And it often runs counter to self-interest, right? I have enough food for myself, but do I want to have to take the time to make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches? Right? And because there's people in need, it's taken away my time, some of my food that I have around my house. But do I go against that which is just my interest in order to care more about society? And that really goes against some of the things where he talked about, like with American exceptionalism, where it says, I am and you're not. Right? Looking across the border and saying, those people who are born south of the border don't have the value I do. It goes against some of our racist ideas in America, where it's my color of skin has value, your color of skin doesn't. And makes us have to question that. So what
I
do we,
think,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think one of the problems we have with looking at anybody who's different or poor or whatever, that of seeing it as a economic stability as a zero-sum game, meaning that, you know, if I make sure you have enough, then I have less, instead of if we all have enough, then we'll all prosper together. I'm reminded, I worked for a while some years ago at a job training center, and one of the people on our board was Bill Estes, who he's already died, but he was a big time developer in the Tucson area for many, many years. But he was on our board and he gave generously, and he got all of his rich developer friends to give generously. And his reason was, the more we train these people, the more they get jobs, the more they pay taxes, and the less I'll have to pay. And that was just his philosophy. But, you know, it worked because he saw that making an investment in people would pay a return to everyone.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we don't always see because we're kind of focused on the what I have now and not thinking as much about the future.
And especially because it's sometimes very convenient to do it the other way, because that way only seems to challenge someone else, not me. And doing the best work isn't a non-challenging type of thing. Like your friend Bill said, he has to give up of his stuff, and maybe it's for the end game selfish reason that'll make my taxes go down, but it is an investment type of thing, right? If people are dying of hunger in our streets and I don't feed them, does that make even if I'm very comfortable, does it leave me non-affected? It has deep implications for my life, doesn't it? But you used a word that I think is an important word with all of this, and it's a very theological word. So I'm glad that you're as theologically trained as what you are. It's the word enough. How much is enough? And how many know how we typically answer that question in America? How much is enough? Just one more.
Yeah.
Just one more. Just one more. Right? And we never know how to stop. And somehow we have to figure out that this is good, and that now I can take the rest of this and do something else with it. But that means that I have to have more than a sense of me. It has to be a sense of us. Do I care enough about the elderly to help somebody really decrepit like Scott Morris? Just kidding, Scott. Right? Do I care enough about that side of society? Do I care enough about the children in society that I fully fund schools, even though I have no kids in school? Do I see all of that as benefiting us? But it means that I have to see you as part of me, not write you off as the other. You talked a lot about none of us is self-made. So I want you to take a few minutes to remember some of the people who helped make you. some of the people who were present in your life in some way or another to make it so that you became who you were? Who was that for you? Who saw you as important enough that they did something?
Well, mine was my grandfather very early on. He saw some of the things I was doing that other people thought were wrong. And he says, no, she's just being an individual. You have to let her have her individuality.
Mm.
And he gave me that feeling of strength,
Yeah.
and that I was somebody. And after that, I thought, well, you know, how else can I please him? How can I be the best girl I could be and still be myself?
Yeah.
So
And the hard part is, Sandy, I'm sorry if this sounds like I'm talking about your age, but when you grew up, when most of us grew up, women weren't often given that type of a message. They were more told
Yeah.
only this much. And so for you to have a
Right.
grandfather who called you to your higher self beyond the boundaries, that was good.
it was.
Remarkable. How about the rest of you? Who helped you?
So I grew up in rural South Dakota, and our little school district, we had a one-room schoolhouse with a maximum of the 8 years that I was there. Probably, maybe we got to a high of 23 students at one point total.
Mhm.
And I can recall the I think it evolved a little bit over the years. There may have been one or two others, but primarily 4 people who made up the school board. One of those was my mother, and they did a fantastic job of ensuring that we had high quality teachers. Did a lot of interviewing, and I think a remarkable job of picking excellent people. And one evidence of that is that in my class of 4 people, 3 of us were every year the top students in the county, based on the standardized tests that were given. So I don't think that was a coincidence that we just happened to be 3 really smart people. I think that those teachers were the impetus of all of that.
Yeah. And they cared, those school board members and the community as a whole had some kind of investment in you beyond their own self-interest. Thank you. How about the rest of you? Who cared enough?
My parents cared enough to make sure that we all had good educations. I grew up for the first 12 years of my life in a working class neighborhood in California, where my parents were among the only ones who had gone to college. The rest of our neighbors were bricklayers and delivery truck drivers and so on, who didn't value education so much. So my parents worked hard to make sure that we all knew it was really, really important to go to school and have that. And then, you know, they helped us get through college, those of us who wanted to go. And that's always been really important to me, that I had the opportunity easily for a college education.
And what you speak is not untypical of my dad's story, although he started at more of a space like Scott, very small town up in rural northeast Arizona. But his parents, my grandparents, saw that his dreams were not to be captured in that small town, and so tried to do whatever they could to help him to see beyond and to get that education. So he went on to get a master's and a PhD, because somebody cared enough to open those doors for him, right? And it wasn't that he didn't do a lot of work. Okay, that self-made man that Borg talked about doesn't deny that you do work. It just says that there's other people that are there that also help you to get there. And sometimes they're not even the people that you know about. I pretty much overlooked garbage men until I became friends with, in my first Methodist church ever, with a man named Bob Nunez, who that was his job. And I saw Bob, first of all, as the human being that he was. And then when he told me about his profession and we got talking about it, I realized how important that was to me, even though Bob was not my garbage man. Right? And do we care enough about that? At least part of why we should go down. So Jenny, you talk about making those peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I've been down to Casa Maria, and it is a hole in the wall. It's a tiny little space, and yet it cares deeply about the people who live in that neighborhood. And Brian Flagg and the folks who are there on a regular basis say, how do we help them to be seen and heard in ways that allows them to become more than what they would without our presence? And it is for Brian, it is not just a, how do I give food to somebody who's hungry? It's how do I care about human beings that are here in need so that they can become better, grow into what they can become. And it's really easy for us to look at the poor and overlook them. In fact, in Yuma, what I learned there was that Yuma sat right across from the downtown public library with a great big lawn, and it was easy for all the homeless to stay on that lawn. Nicely shaded, one of the only shaded places in all of Yuma, right? And homeless people learn really quickly to try to be invisible. But one of the most important things we do is we recognize them as human beings. So in the summer, which it gets a bit hot in the summer in Yuma,
Yeah.
when we decided to start opening our doors and say, come in the afternoon and sit here in the air conditioning, it was counterintuitive to both them and to us, because we'd been taught to overlook, they'd been taught to be overlooked. But I discovered some amazing people in that homeless population. People who often had very strong connections to me in one way or another. How do we help them to become, how do we see them so that they become what they can become, whoever those people are?
Earl was saying about the Boy Scouts too. We should learn about that.
Yeah, I have quite a history with the Boy Scouts, being a scoutmaster and a leader. My father was the chair of the scouting efforts in our church, and been to several U.S. Celebrations for Boy Scouts. So that's sort of quite an influence on my life.
Yeah. And Earl, were any of those Boy Scouts at first glance troublesome in any way?
I would say probably a majority. They were all sort of people that had a lot of energy and things to get it accomplished, and
Yeah.
they just had the right place to go to accomplish some of those things.
One of my Boy Scouts was a man named Todd. Todd Turley was his name. And let's see, it was about 1983 85, 86, 87 that I met Todd. 15 years later, I went to Good Samaritan Hospital in Phoenix as a pastor, and I'm there visiting somebody in my church when the doctor comes in, and it is Todd Turley,
Wow.
right? And so this troublesome, 14-year-old became much more than just that.
Neat.
And isn't that what we all want to do? How do we help whoever this person is become more? Right? When we had Francisco here in this building, it wasn't just because oh, I'm taking care of someone who's poor. It's that here's an amazing human being, and how do we help him to step into who he is and have the ability to bring his family into a wonderful space, right? And if you worked with him at all, you realize that their family is an amazing family. And we get to do that all the time if we let ourselves. And his point is that Christianity, that's exactly what it's about. It's about looking and saying, not what's right for me, which bad religion very often becomes just what makes my life easier. Prosperity gospel is that way. If I just believe I'll get richer, it's about what makes our society better. How do I reach out and care for so that we end up making something better than what was here at the first? But isn't that what our nation is about as well? He talked about the Bill of Rights, and what the Bill of Rights calls us to is something better than. And we fight against things like that. He talked specifically about the establishment of the religion clause. It would be much simpler if everyone believed just like me. There'd be much fewer clashes in the world. Well, I'd like to think that at least. But that idea of trusting each other and helping each other in that trust is what really defines the profoundness that the Christ voice calls us to. So we have one more week. Last 2 chapters next week. We're getting there. Thinking about from the beginning to now, what's this book calling into you? How's it helping you? What's it giving to you?
Given a voice to all the things I always thought, and then he puts it in such good words.
He has a way of.
He clarifies.
He does have a way of doing that, doesn't he?
I think where I'm finding this helpful is I've read a lot of Marcus Borg's stuff over the years, but this is a pretty good distillation of all of his, quote, convictions. And it would be a good book to recommend to people that's not as detailed or long or as some of his other books are.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Doris, that this is kind of where he tries to just summarize his life learnings.
Yeah.
In some ways, not into the real huge depths, but just to say, here's kind of where God has led me.
Well, and for me, it's been helpful in providing a kind of framework for my reminiscing about the people and events and conversions in my life. To not forget those is important, I think.
Yeah. And Judy, that's really important as you go to the last couple chapters and beyond. You want to say, so which of these are my convictions? What other things do I add to them? What have been the pillars that give me the strength to be able to do what I'm doing? And how do I recognize and maximize them for whatever time I have left on earth, right? so that they truly change both me and the world around me. How many have found that some of these convictions match pretty well with what you're thinking anyway? How many have found ones that you might articulate slightly different, but somewhere along the lines? He's good at being able to say, you don't have to be my convictions, but you do need to have them. Right? All right. Thank you. We have 2 chapters left. I will see you next week.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Take care,
Thank
my friend.
you. Bye.
What do we
Bye.
do about thing for Sunday?
Oh yeah, let me stay with you. Let me finish that.